In this video, we will learn about variables. What are variables? Why do we use variables? Why do we need variables? So when we are writing a program, when we are solving a business problem, when we are writing a program to do something, to achieve something, we often need to store some data. It could be, let's say, an amount, it could be the gender of a person, a roll number of a student, the salary of an employee. It could be anything, but the point is we often need to store the data. And where do we store it? We store the data in a variable. A variable, you can say, is like a container that holds something, that holds some data, some value. A variable can be as simple as to store an integer value, for example a roll number, or it could be a very complex object, a very complex variable, let's say a map of key values. Now in Java we deal with two types of variables: primitive and reference variables. So whatever we discuss today applies to both primitive and reference. We will understand reference in a bit more detail in one of the future lessons, but understand it now that whatever we discuss here, it's basically same for primitive and reference both. So we saw that variables are used to store the values. Now how many types of variables there are actually in Java? So in Java it could be an instance variable, it could be a static variable, it could be a local variable. Now when we declare a method, when we write a method can have some arguments. That also is a variable. And whatever, let's say the method is returning some value, then sometimes we store that return value before actually returning the method, so that is also a variable. Now let's see these variables in a bit more detail. So let's say we have a class student, public class student. Now if we define a variable like this, let's say public int roll number, and we may have another variable, let's say public static int counter, and then we may have a method. So let's say a method returns an integer, and let's name it calculate age, for example. It accepts an input parameter int age. Then let's say we define another variable of temp, which basically holds age cross 10 value, and then we return temp value from this method. So again there are many things that we need to explore in a bit more detail in one of the future lessons, but for now it is a valid class. We see that this is an integer variable, which is basically a primitive. Whatever we define here, these all are primitive variables. Now you see a variable that is defined outside of any method like roll number or counter, but without any additional keyword. This is important. For example, take an example of this roll number. This is defined outside of any method, but it simply has an access modifier, the data type and name of the variable. This is called instance variable. Now counter. Counter is also declared outside of any method. It has an access modifier, the data type, but it has an additional keyword static. So this is called a static variable. Any variable that is defined with the keyword static is called a static variable. Now coming to the method, it says that the method would accept a parameter, an integer argument. So whoever is calling this method will have to pass an integer value. So this is again a variable declaration of type int. What about this one? We are using the same value age, we multiply it with 10, and then we are storing the result in a variable called temp, which is again of type integer, but such variables are called local variables. So this is a local variable, this is also a local variable, and the return type, this is again a local variable. Why? Because the scope is limited. These variables are only accessible within the boundary of method. So outside this method we cannot directly call temp, or we cannot directly use temp. So such variables are called local variables because their scope is limited. Alright, in the next video we will talk about how do we declare a variable, and we will focus a bit more on the primitive variables. That's it.